Welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Ben Francis. Tonight's show will, of course, focus on the looming general election, but first we'll start with the Ukraine update on day 820 of the conflict. France? Sorry, and I'm also joined by Siobhan Tolland. Sorry, I went too far, went too fast with the intro. Hey. So now back to the Ukraine update. France has carried out its first test firing an updated nuclear-capable missile, the ASMPAR, designed to be launched by the Rafale fighter jet, according to the French defense minister. It came a day after Russia said it began nuclear drills in its southern military district, which stretched from Russia into occupied Ukrainian territory. The announcement of Russian drills is partly directed at France after its president, Emmanuel Macron, said he would not rule out sending troops into Ukraine on Ukraine's side. Quote, lethal aid is now flowing from China to Russia and into Ukraine, end quote, Grant Shapps, the British Defence Secretary, told a London conference on Wednesday. Quote, today I can reveal that we have evidence that Russia and China are collaborating on combat equipment for use in Ukraine, end quote, he said, attributing the information to US and British defense intelligence. In the US, however, Joe Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, said that while there were concerns China might, quote, provide weapons directly lethal assistance to Russia, we have not seen that to date, end quote. The US did have a, quote, concern about what China's doing to fuel Russia's war machine, not giving weapons directly, but providing inputs to Russia's defense industrial base, end quote. A Russian airstrike on Kharkiv city on Wednesday destroyed a cafe, damaged a nearby residential building, and set a petrol station ablaze. Local officials said 10 people were wounded, including, said regional prosecutor, a trolley bus driver who had both legs amputated. Russia used a UMPBD-30 guided bomb launched from the bordering Belgorod region, prosecutor said. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky made a plea for defenses against the guided bombs, which had become, quote, the main instrument used in Russian attacks, end quote. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is pushing a proposal in the Biden administration to let Ukraine fire American weapons into Russia, the New York Times has reported. It comes after Blinken visited Ukraine last week and said the US did not encourage striking into Russia, but it should be up to the Ukrainians to decide on their own. So, Siobhan, what do you think are like the prospects for escalation in the conflict? You know, especially given, I guess, China getting more roped into it and like nuclear posturing getting a bit more intense.
Yeah, it's definitely a danger, isn't it? I think when the empires begin to get involved, there's a sense of kind of, there's a sense of territorialism, which can often lead to a wider escalation of war. It is concerning. It feels like war is escalating across the board, actually, not just there. But yeah, it's worrying.
Yeah. Do you think of anything the UK government could do to potentially reduce escalation or calm matters down?
I think we need to. I think we need to seriously think about a strategy on how to deal with Russia. I think that there's an element of we're kind of just turning a blind eye to aggressive behaviour, and it is a fine line. And we were speaking about this the last time I was
Yeah.
on, but there is that fine line, isn't it? But I do think that I, I'm at loss of what to do, but the one thing that the UK cannot do is increase the aggression, which they often have a tendency to do. So the last thing the UK should be doing is trying to increase the tensions in that area and trying to do everything they can to decrease.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't think that that's going to be the case.
Yeah, no, it doesn't seem like it. So on to our next story, the Israel Gaza update, or the Israel Gaza latest update. The Hostage Families Forum in Israel has released graphic footage of female Israeli soldiers captured by Hamas from a military base during the 7th of October attacks. The 3-minute video showed the women, all IDF personnel, sitting on the ground, some bruised and bloodied, with their hands tied after their capture from the Nal al-Oz base in southern Israel. Tomorrow, the International Court of Justice will announce its decision on South Africa's request for an order to halt Israeli military actions in the Gaza Strip. Ahead of that verdict, Israel has said it will not deter from pursuing its war on Hamas. Asked whether Israel would comply with a possible ICJ ruling against it, an Israeli government spokesperson said, quote, "No power on earth will stop Israel from protecting its citizens and going after Hamas in Gaza," end quote. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has warned of the risk of a, quote, "humanitarian crisis," end quote, if Israel cuts off a crucial financing channel to Palestinian banks, ahead of a meeting of G7 finance ministers in Stresa in northern Italy. She told reporters she was particularly concerned by Israel's threats to take action that would lead to Palestinian banks being cut off from their Israeli correspondent banks. She added, "These banking channels are critical for processing transactions that enable almost $8 billion US a year in imports from Israel, including electricity, water, fuel, and food, as well as facilitating almost $2 billion a year in exports on which Palestinian livelihoods depend." Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is set to worsen once again as deliveries of aid and fuel to the Palestinian territories slow to a trickle in the wake of Israel's 2-week-old ground offensive in the southern Palestinian city of Rafah. A 2-day Israeli raid on the occupied West Bank city of Jenin killed at least 12 Palestinians, health authorities and an Agence France press correspondent reported. So, do you think that a point, Siobhan, might come when Israel eventually starts becoming more influenced by this growing international pressure on it?
No, no, I don't think they will. I don't think they will. They if they're saying that they are going to ignore the International Court of Justice in whatever they say, and if they are still continuing to say we will not stop, then no, I don't think they will stop unless there is a change of government or unless the US intervene on some level. I don't think Israel care. Sorry, I should change that. I don't think the Israel government care about international pressure, because it is important, I think, to make that distinction between the Israeli people and the Israeli government. I don't think they care. I think their sole focus genuinely is the destruction of Gaza and the destruction of the Palestinian people and the livelihood that they live there. I think, unfortunately, we're living with an extreme right wing government that does not care about the consequences, and it's not until we stop. And it's a bit like Russia in that respect as well. This is a kind of a political nation and a political
Mm.
government out of control and not caring about what the international community says. So unfortunately, I don't think so. If they cared, if they thought that if international pressure was likely to impact on them, they wouldn't have moved in. And they wouldn't have moved in. They wouldn't be in a situation where, excuse me, I'm sorry, my cat's there. They wouldn't be making sure that the energy runs out. I mean, the Al-Aqsa hospital has got minutes left of energy, and then the hospital will cease to function. So there's those real risks, and Netanyahu has no care or concern beyond this quote right to defend themselves. And it's a very kind of, it looks like a very innocuous quote on the surface, and it seems to be that quote that gets quoted a lot of the times by Conservatives and Labour as well within the UK and across the globe as well. But this is not self-defence. This is not self-defence. This stopped being self-defence a very, very long time ago. This is a genocide. This is an attack. This is an ethnic cleansing. And they've said continuously they will not stop. Doesn't matter what the ICJ says. ICJ doesn't matter.
So, moving on to our main story of the night, the UK general election. Opposition parties across the United Kingdom have launched their official general election campaigns today. These include the Labour Party, Liberal Democrats, Green Party, Reform UK, SNP, Alba Party, Workers' Party of Britain, and many smaller parties which don't have any parliamentary representation. But before we get into what might happen in the election campaign, first we'll touch on why Prime Minister Rishi Sunak decided to call the election months earlier than most political commentators expected. So, Siobhan, just given the Conservatives are 20 points behind the polls right now in Labour, why do you think Rishi Sunak decided like now was a good time to call the election?
I mean, the critics are saying that it's in part because he was aware that the economy was not going to get better. So he had to kind of strike just before it begins to kind of, because that promise has been for economic recovery, hasn't it? That the interest rates would come down, that things would kind of begin to stabilise. But that next 6 months didn't seem to be that recovery that they hoped for and that they expected. So that seems to be one reason why. There's another element, I think, for me is I know that there were signatures being collected in order to try and oust Rishi Sunak. And I think, I don't know, this is just speculation, but I do think that there's an element of he perhaps thought, right, well, I'll jump now. Before there's any more attempts to oust him in the party. However, having said that, the rumour in Westminster is, and that's been reported in the newspaper, is that most of the MPs didn't know that this was going to happen, that Rishi Sunak was going to announce. No, very few MPs didn't, never knew, and also there is a move and a shift to still try and oust him, to try and push back the general election date. I don't know what truth that there is in that, but it certainly tells you a sense of chaos that's happening. Channel 4 News reported last night that actually Rishi Sunak wasn't quite sure of when it was going to happen, and it was suddenly very last minute. So sounds like a little bit of panic as well. The Rwanda situation, I think, seems to come in. He seems to be very intent on trying to get something done regarding the Rwanda prospects, and I think he's hoping that it might happen during this election. But I don't think he would have improved from 20 points behind, I'm going to be honest. So this is probably the best he thought he could get.
Yeah, it does seem like that might have been the case. They were potentially waiting to hope for some sort of improvement, but then they've just been getting slightly worse, if anything, over the last 6 months.
Yeah.
I wonder if you think it's anything to do with the rise of Reform UK, because obviously in the last couple of months in particular, like they've started to take away the Conservative, voter, like the voter base. Do you think the Tories are perhaps having an earlier election with the fear that if they leave it another 6 months, like by the time that election comes, they could be head to head?
There is definitely an element of that, I think, isn't there? And it's certainly something that's been getting discussed in the kind of media rounds as well. That it would. It's one thing getting beat by an established political party. It's an entirely different thing to go head to head with a party, a relatively small
Yeah.
party, that might eventually beat you. So yes, and yeah, it didn't look like it was getting any better. Reform, if you look at I think that the council elections probably gave them a little bit of a scare in that respect as well, that Reform did kind of relatively well. So there was probably, I think, an element of that thinking, oh God, if
Yeah,
we
yeah,
lose to
yeah.
Reform, they're gone for the rest of the century, probably.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that could have been the end. That could still
Yeah.
be the end of the party.
Well, it could be, and here's hoping. Sorry, I don't pretend to, I don't try and mask my dislike for the Conservatives, but here's hoping it might be for them.
Yeah. So just moving on to the election itself, and like Labour more specifically, like, do you think a Labour victory is inevitable in the election, or do you think there's a chance that like even though they have a large lead now, it could like change a lot by the time election day actually comes?
You never know. You never know with an election, and politics is, especially in these days, politics is incredibly unpredictable. I have never quite fallen in with that kind of, it's inevitable Labour's going to win. I think that, I think it might depend on how much media attention and rigour of that attention is done on the Labour Party. I think a short election actually helps Labour in that respect
Yeah.
because there's less depth of interrogation into the Labour Party. To be honest, all the Labour Party really need to do is just keep quiet. The problem is that they are self-harming in terms of their policies and stuff as well. So there's an element there that they may not do as well as they like. There could be also an element of complacency. Oh, it's like, oh, Labour will win, so it'll be fine. I don't think people are enthused about Labour. It's not like a Labour are beginning to enthuse people to get out and vote. It's more of a kind of, well, let's get the Tories out. So it's a kind of passive, almost defensive voting mechanism there. So
Yeah.
there might be an element that those people might not come out and vote on the day. And we can never predict what will happen in an election campaign, what issues come up.
Yeah.
And Keir Starmer can completely changes these positions so much that it's going to be quite difficult for them, I think, to hold a line of policy development.
Yeah, no, I was gonna ask, like, do you think Keir Starmer might be a liability? Because like yesterday when I was watching Rishi Sunak do his announcement for the general election, he mentioned the
Yeah.
fact that Keir Starmer, effectively U-turned in every policy he got elected Labour leader on, and he's not exactly like he doesn't poll very high either, like opinion polls Keir Starmer in popularity. So, do you think he could be a liability for Labour in the campaign?
I mean, I think there is an element of that. There's this kind of Labour are kind of. I mean, traditionally they've been quite left to centre, and obviously ratios. When Keir Starmer came in, he promised he would, you know, he promised he would heal the divisions, but actually what he did do is he did a bit of a kind of an ousting of those on the left, including people like Jeremy Corbyn and so forth as well. So there's an element there that there's a bit of a base. The one person that enthused young voters, for instance, in England and Wales was Jeremy Corbyn, but of course he's now kind of been kind of bit hatcheted out of that party. There's an element, I think, that he's certainly not popular in Scotland, Keir Starmer, and that maybe works to our advantage here in Scotland, and if for SNP anyway. Um, I think it might depend on the debates. I think the problem, though, as you said yourself, I think the problem with Keir Starmer is that because their positioning changes so much, that he might struggle to be consistent in a debate. And it'll be interesting to see what they do there. But I think sometimes the debates can kind of like if, especially if they do something really wrong, or something stupid, or that kind of thing, that kind of gasping in front of the TV screen as we watch
Yeah,
it, then it could be potentially. But I mean, it's everything to lose for Labour. You know what I
yeah,
mean? It's kind of. I mean, Labour, they're not even having to do anything in their head of the polls, but it's theirs to lose, and they
yeah,
could.
yeah. So then, sort of on the Conservatives, do you think, like, in
Mm.
sort of the same way as Labour, do you think it's like quite foregone that they'll lose the election?
The thing with the Conservatives is they tend to have a kind of the voters tend to come out. Conservative voters tend to come out more than other voters. I think there is an element as well that the party can often come together in quite a strong way to kind of protect the party. Um, it's I mean, it would be an amazing resurgence of the Conservative Party if they, if they won, or even if they managed to kind of secure a bit of a hung parliament. That would be quite an event for them.
Yeah,
But it's never say never, and I think that it does depend on Labour. Having said that, I think people are so scunnered with the Tories. And it comes back to what you were saying about Reform UK.
yeah,
There is an element that I think that people can't quite stomach to vote Conservative again. So I
yeah.
think that there's maybe an element that those that they've lost, they've certainly lost for this general election.
Yeah, I mean, like, do you think there's a possibility, like at all, that like the Conservative Party could get like wiped out, and mostly not even as much because of Labour, but because of Reform UK as well. Like, if it managed to, do you think Reform UK could eat into a lot of their vote share and potentially leave the Conservatives with like a very low amount of seats and even destroy the party? Because like you see in France, for example, in Italy, you see the main centre
Yeah.
right parties. They've been destroyed in the last 10 years. The Conservative, they're quite a, quite an exception. They're one of the only parties in Western Europe, which have actually increased their vote share since the 2008 financial crash.
Because they turned as right as the the more marginalised right wing parties. That's the only reason the Tories. I mean, that's exactly what Brexit done, wasn't it? That's exactly what Nigel Farage's campaign did. It was turning the Conservatives more right wing and extreme right wing. That there would be indistinguishable between some of the European neo-fascist parties. Quite frankly, Rwanda, I think, is a really good example of that. The hostile environment being another one as well. It's hard with the first past the post system because it privileges the larger parties. But there tends to be a tipping point at which that once you hit a tipping point, either for good or bad, then you can either just explode into getting kind of loads of seats, like what kind of, SNP did in 2015, or you can collapse. And that's where the SNP are a wee bit at the moment as well. We've got this kind of like fear that there might, we might reach that kind of tipping point where the SNP could potentially collapse. Not to the degree of the Conservatives. It's hard to guess, and I think it might depend on Reform's campaign as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So just like lastly, I'm going to move on to Scotland after this, but
Yeah.
in terms of still keeping on the UK, do you think like voters have more generally, do you think voters have like a real choice in this election, especially compared to previous elections where obviously you had Jeremy Corbyn's Labour, and if you agree or disagree, they had a very distinct policy platform from the Conservative. But now, just personally, me looking at it, I'm thinking how I felt now versus how I felt when the 2019 general election got called. And it seems to me like at the moment, both the parties, the Conservatives and Labour, they seem quite indistinguishable in a lot of ways.
Yeah, yeah. I feel for England. I feel for England quite a lot actually, because for exactly that reason, there seems to be very, very little choice. And you can see why people would vote for Labour within England, because again, it's get the Tories out, and that
Yeah.
seems to be the kind of overriding kind of consensus, I think, down there. But unfortunately, what's happened is that Labour, as you said, they've shifted more to the right rather than
Mm.
have that kind of, rather than kind of stick to a kind of clear, solid left of centre social policy platform. They seem to have kind of disintegrated that and shifted more to the right, despite the fact that actually they're on. They're on a kind of track to kind of absolutely win and beat the Conservatives hand down. It becomes very, very disillusioning when there is no choice. And this kind of, I mean, I'm old enough to remember kind of, the Blair years and what happened post Blair, as we began to realise that actually there wasn't much choice, and it created a certain political despondency. Until the notion of independence, as we'll get into Scotland, but until the notion of independence came along, then there was a political despondency, I think, and that's unfortunate. And that's when fascism begins to seep in, unfortunately, as well. The choice they seem to have is right, or even more right.
Yeah. So yeah, moving on to Scotland, then how do you think the SNP like will do in the election? Do you think they'll follow a similar like path of the Tories? I mean, I don't think they're as unpopular as the Tories, but they are polling worse than they were in previous elections. Sure.
Yes, they are, and it's quite. I mean, there's no point in denying that the SNP's been in a bit of trouble. I think there's a lot of issues that we've had to contend with. The first big issue that we've got at the moment, of course, is that we've got a new leader and he's literally just in the door. So there's an element of the electorate don't even really know him that well. So there's that element as well. John Swinney wasn't even allowed really time to bed down as a leader. So that's problematic, and that comes at the back of all the other problems as well. I, in my experience, the SNP or independence supporting parties always do better than we think. 2017 probably being that one exception, but we always do better than we think we're going to do, and we're often surprised at the level of commitment to SNP independence and actually to Europe as well, as we noted in 2019, because it was the pro-European parties that won quite well in the general election, SNP included. It's that tipping point again. If we can increase, if we can gain, we lost about 5%, generally speaking, across the board after Nicola Sturgeon left. If we can kind of regain some of that, then we hit that tipping point where we can start to kind of or keep the seats that we've got. I think that we will lose, probably, it looks like we'll lose some in the Central Belt, more likely to be the Glasgow area as well. But let's see what happens. It's all. I think at this stage for the SNP, it's all to play for. It's one of the things that I was at the NEC on Saturday, and it's that kind of discussion about putting independence at the front, at the core of that campaign, because it is the only thing that the SNP must and should and has to offer that is different from any other party. We have to offer that hope that there could be something different, and that we will be the ones to take that forward. We'll just have to wait and see. I'm not going to pretend that I'm not nervous. And an early election was not good for the SNP, so it
Yeah.
gives us a little bit more of a
Mhm.
battle. But the just today, anecdotally, there seemed to be a focus. Suddenly, activists anyway began to become much more focused, and our like HQ in Dundee was like the phone just did not stop ringing by people saying, "How do I get a kind of proxy vote? How do I get this? How can I make sure that I'm able to vote?" So there was
Yeah.
lots of people kind of just trying to galvanise in. We need to build momentum, and it's getting that. And if we can build a little bit of momentum, then I think we can at least retain some of the seats that we've got. I would say 40 is a really good,
Okay.
would
Yeah.
be an excellent election result for the SNP. Anecdotally as well, I had a friend that said, "Oh, I was going to vote Green." She says, "But I really think I need to vote SNP." And it was like, yeah, you really do, because it's first past the post. But actually, she just come back from Europe, and she said that fascism felt so strong there, and that was the reason. That was the reason she wanted to vote SNP, because she wanted to make sure that we had a left of centre Democratic Party representing us.
I guess you don't need to, you can be quick on this one, but like, do you think
Yeah,
Labour could win in Scotland? Because we sort of covered that already. Like, do you think that's a possibility? Like,
it is.
sorry, I guess, like, and how sort of how strong do you think their current sort of support is in the polls in Scotland? Like, like sort of specifically.
It's again, it's that tipping point,
Yeah,
actually. I mean, to a certain extent, SNP or Labour are a bit like this. Sometimes they're neck and neck, sometimes SNP are ahead, sometimes Labour are just slightly ahead. Um, if the Labour Party begin to gain momentum, and kind of reach that tipping point, then they may kind of they could. It's potentially possible that they could win a majority. In political reality, though, I am not necessarily convinced that will be
mm,
the case. I think that there's that tension between Scottish Labour, UK Labour, and that whole kind of process. The one thing that the SNP has going is that the leader and actually the deputy leader are quite popular, much more popular than people like Anna Sauer, and they're relatively new to the government as well. It's technically possible, whether politically it's possible or probable. That's another case. But let's discuss that again on July the 5th.
yeah. And do you think, sort of moving away from the main parties, do you think
Mm.
smaller parties in Scotland, especially smaller left wing parties like the Greens or Socialist parties, could do well in this election, given Labour's rightward shift, and I get the SNP's to a degree decline in popularity?
Um, you might see a slight bounce in the Greens. The Scottish Socialist Party, not so. I think they've had their day, and they're very small. They always have been. They always will be. In part because they don't know how to build any kind of sense of sustained movement, because they don't really go where the people are at. They tend to always sit on the margins. I say that as a socialist. I just don't think that they don't know, they don't understand how to meet the needs and aspirations of people. They don't know how to engage with people within Scotland. So no, I think the Scottish Socialist Party or the Socialist parties will never do that well, especially in a first past the post system. It's usually things like Scottish Parliament or local elections that these smaller parties would do well. The Greens are slightly different, though, because they've had a bit of, they've had a much more gaze upon them through the Scottish Parliament, and of course what's happened recently, the kind of break in the Boot House Agreement and so forth. So there's a bit of
Yeah.
light on the Green Party, which is quite unusual. The problem is it is first past the post, and it is a UK first past the post, which is dominated by the two larger parties. So it's usually, I mean, I was reading earlier on, I think it was in The Guardian, that there was that kind of, there might not even be the smaller parties in the debate. It might just be between Labour and Conservatives. So there's a massive blocking of the smaller parties in terms of the political discourse that happens in a
Okay.
UK general election. So they very rarely get a voice. I think the SNP will struggle to get a voice in this election, especially with things like the debates and so forth. So, but Greens might surprise us a little bit. I
Okay.
don't think they'll
Yeah.
get seats, but they might have an increase.
Okay. Yeah. So just lastly, how do you think the election is going to affect like the independence movement in general?
I think there's a couple of things that we need to. I think we need to establish, and we need to kind of think quite clearly about as we move into this election. From an SNP perspective, I think, and this has been obviously a councillor with the SNP, from an SNP perspective, I think we need to understand that it's that the movement is much bigger than the SNP. I think we do realise that, but I think we need to start acting a bit more like that. For the rest of the independence movement perspective, however, I think there needs to be a disengagement from the anti-SNP rhetoric that is occurring, because it's only splitting the movement, and we are in a general election. I think what needs to be understood is whether we liked this or not, and I didn't like it, I don't think anybody likes this election will determine the political temperature and the appetite for independence. And if we lose a majority of seats in this election, then it will be interpreted as there is no appetite for independence. So whether people like it or not, a vote for the SNP is a vote for independence, and it marks that as a vote for independence. Now, I know that some parts of the independence movement do have some issues with the SNP. There's an element of, well, what are they going to do? We've been there before. That may be fair criticism. That may be fair criticism. But this election is an election. If we do not vote SNP, if the independence movement does not come out and vote SNP, then we're likely to lose the momentum for independence, and it will be interpreted by the UK and internationally, which is really important as well, is that the appetite for independence is now waning. And that's the dilemma that we've got. Unfortunately, we're in a circumstance where it's become party political, not because of the SNP, but because we've been refused a referendum. And that's the thing, because in everybody's eyes, a referendum is the best, the most democratic, the most equal way of gathering information on what we want to do with a country. But we're not allowed to do that. So we have to move this general election into an independence arena. And that, unfortunately, has made it party political. So that is my kind of speech of the day, is that we have got to keep focused. We have to, a vote for the SNP is a vote to promote independence and push independence and make sure that it will always be on the agenda. So there is an element there we really need to understand that.
Okay, so just to move on to the last sort of story of
Yeah.
the general election, Scots have been issued with a voting rules warning ahead of the summer's general election. The vote is scheduled for July the 4th, when many people will be on holiday and some Scotland fans will be at the Euros. With the registration deadline just 4 weeks away, Scotland's National Advice Agency has urged people to be aware of the rules surrounding the election to ensure that they don't miss out on their chance to vote. People who are intending to cast their vote in the July 4th ballot must register before midnight on Tuesday, June 18th. Anyone who is abroad on the day of the election can switch to a postal or proxy vote, but to be able to vote, you must be aged 18 or over on the day of the election and be a British citizen, a qualifying Commonwealth citizen, or a citizen of the Republic of Ireland. Andrew Bartlett, chief executive of Advice Direct Scotland, said, quote, Rishi Sunak's decision to call a general election on July the 4th has taken a lot of people by surprise. So it's important that Scots are prepared and not caught out by the voting rules. So Siobhan, I just wondered, like more broadly, what do you think of the Conservative attempts, like running up to this election, to effectively like suppress the vote with their ID
Well,
laws?
it's in the spirit of the Conservatives' anti-democratic structure. I mean, the Conservatives are not fans of democracy, and the more right wing they become, the less fans of democracy they do become. And I keep saying this, and I keep coming back to it, but to me, is a template of it set the tone exactly for where they went. Immediately after the Brexit vote, they tried to bypass Parliament. They tried to get Brexit through by bypassing Parliament, and they had to be dragged through the courts in order to consult with Parliament in order to get that done. That is the lack of democratic tone that the Conservatives have had, and it's only become worse. I think that when you start to make it harder for people to vote, then it privileges those who are more privileged and those who are more likely to vote Conservative. So you have that whole process there that it is that kind of, lots of people have lots of issues. I mean, people are just trying to get through their working day at this moment in time, trying to scrape through life, especially with the Conservative implemented kind of issues that we've had. So adding extra barriers for people to vote, it is a way of suppressing the vote, and it's been done across various different countries. It's not something. This is not new. This is something that's kind of been a tried and tested modus operandi, and for people, so if you try and make it more difficult to vote, and then becomes harder, and it often benefits those in power. So I don't think it'll work for the Conservatives, because I still think they're so unpopular that even that won't work. But yeah, I mean, it is an anti-democratic process. I think there is absolutely no doubt about it. We should be making it easier for people to vote, not more difficult.
Yeah, no, I think surveys were taken after the council elections, the local elections, and I think they showed the people who were basically the kind of demographics who were more likely to not vote conservative voted less, like young people and people from ethnic minority backgrounds, as you sort of expect. So yeah, and I just finally on this, do you think like we should sort of like as a country, especially with the next general election coming, do you think we should try and address this problem, like with voter suppression, maybe like make it illegal? Because it does seem like quite a severe issue for democracy that a governing party can just suppress the vote in order to stay in power. It seems quite antithetical to a democracy.
Yes. Do you mean in Scotland, or do you mean in the
I
UK?
mean, in the UK specifically, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I hope that, I mean, I would hope that Labour would assuming they get in, and the chances are quite high, I suppose. I would hope that they would. My issue perhaps with Labour is that they're not pro democracy at their core. I think they like to pretend they are, but they're not. And we just need to look at that from issues of a referendum. Let the Scottish people decide, and Labour say no because we don't agree with that. And that's their positioning. That's an anti-democratic positioning, and they can dress it up in whatever way they want to see fit. But it is an anti-democratic positioning. The Scottish people are not allowed to decide on their future because Labour don't agree with them. So the problem that you might have is that democracy is not a core value, I don't think, in the Labour Party anymore. If it was, then it would be something that they would be talking about. I would be using it as an election campaign, quite frankly. Come out and vote, and we will make it easier for others to vote
yeah,
in the future. But that doesn't seem to be the case. I've not seen their manifesto yet, to be fair, though. Let's see if it's on the agenda.
yeah. So now moving away from the general election toward the next story, the COVID inquiry. The UK's top civil servant, Simon Cates, has told the UK COVID-19 inquiry that he found Boris Johnson's style of working, quote, very frustrating, and described his day-to-day administration as, quote, dysfunctional. Giving evidence on Thursday morning, the Cabinet Secretary discussed his deep, quote, regret over sending scathing WhatsApp messages about Mr. Johnson during the pandemic. He added he did not initially understand how, quote, personally difficult Mr. Johnson found it to introduce lockdowns and described him as a, quote, great communicator. Asked about the day-to-day administration of government, Mr. Kane said, quote, it was definitely dysfunctional and it was difficult. Oddly enough, sclerotic isn't quite the right word, end quote. In July 2020, before he became cabinet secretary, Mr. Cates said, quote, I've never seen, a bunch of people less well equipped to run a country, end quote, in a message to Lord Sedwell, who was the civil service chief at the time. So, Siobhan, do you think that the inquiry will do enough to hold politicians to account over what happened in COVID? And do you think it's a bit of a problem that it's taking such a long time? Because even for me, COVID feels like a long time ago. I think for a lot of people, it's the
Yeah,
same.
yeah. I mean, I think we need to have an inquiry. I think it needed to be done because we need to reflect on mistakes, reflect on good practice, bad practice, because otherwise, when the next pandemic comes, and there will be another one, we need to be perhaps better prepared. I can't remember which country it was at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. They were extraordinarily organised, and part of the reason that they were extraordinarily organised because they'd had a kind of bit of a pandemic about a decade before, and it was so badly dealt with that there was actually a backlash. So they learnt that lesson, and that protected them. And I can't remember the name of the country actually, but they learnt that lesson and it protected them. My problem here is that there is a lot of discussion about how dysfunctional the Conservative Party were. And oh, they were absolutely dysfunctional. It was scarily dysfunctional, corrupt, illegal, absolutely heartless in their attempts to try and deal with the COVID pandemic. But that doesn't give us much answers, beyond let's not vote another dysfunctional government again.
Yeah,
So it's like when we become distracted by the dysfunction of government, and it was, um, are we answering the questions that maybe we should be, that we need the answers to? So there's an element of that as well. It feels a little bit that it's been subject to a little bit of kind of media frenzy, which has kind of directed the tone of the investigation in a way that's maybe not going to be as useful as we perhaps hoped it would be. So there's issues there. It's maybe timely at the beginning of the general election. It does feel like a long time ago. I think that time just completely went skewy with in that time, but
yeah,
it's maybe a timely reminder of how genuinely, genuinely disgraceful the Conservative Party's attempt to deal with that COVID pandemic. We couldn't have had a worse government at a worse time. And that's why they're 20% in the polls behind. And it surprises me that they're only 20% in the polls behind. But we do need to have a lot of kind of questions about what we could have done, what we should have done, and what we did wrong, and how we can kind of start that again. Should another pandemic come along?
yeah. No, no, I feel like you're right about the functionality point you're making there. A lot of these reports do seem quite like political gossip rather than like functionally what can we do next time to actually like what kind of procedural implement can we implement? Can we do?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But I'll have to move on to the next story. Looking at the time, to on the Post Office Horizon inquiry. At the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry, former CEO Paula Vanelv said she doesn't recall, quote, making any concessions debate, making any conscious decisions, not to go back and put in place a review of all past criminal cases, end quote, and has denied that media coverage was a factor in deciding to put a time limit on the review of cases. She has been shown a document by Mark Davies, head of communications at the post office, in which he advises her that announcing a review of all past cases would, quote, open this up very significantly into front page news, end quote. Jason Beer, KC, then got her to reveal that even after she left the post office, she has stayed in touch with Davies and had been giving her personal PR advice about this inquiry. She said she stayed in touch with him, quote, for reasons that were very personal to him, end quote. SNP MSP that's the next story. So Siobhan, the sort of was clumped together in the auto cue, but
It's like, I don't remember him saying anything about
yeah,
that.
normally they're separated by a line. But so on the post office inquiry, Siobhan, what do you think, or do you think the inquiry will sort of do enough to hold those accountable in the post office?
I think sometimes that an inquiry is often kind of set up in order not to. And this is all my concern. Often my concern. It's that kind of. It's like, let's set up an inquiry that'll make people feel better, but actually accountability kind of gets almost escaped a little bit. It sits on her head, and I did see. I've not been following it as much as perhaps I should have done, but I did see a clip, and she looked just genuinely upset and distraught, actually, and I did feel quite a sympathy for her, but not that much. Not as much as the sympathy as those that kind of got sent to prison. We know what happened. We know that post office knew. So there has to be some accountability here, and the buck has to stop somewhere. It's one of the biggest it's one of the biggest cover-ups in modern British history. I mean, it was a disgraceful thing. So I hope so. I really, really hope so, because we have these situations and they happen so often, don't they? It's like you see kind of people fighting for decades for justice, and it's exhausting, and it comes down on the individuals and their families, and to just constantly push the state, constantly push those organisations in order to get justice. Well, justice should be easier to have. And sometimes I just think that inquiries often just try and block that accountability by trying to kind of obfuscate the whole process. So I hope so. I hope so. There's been some inquiries that have been quite kind of candid in their conclusions. So I hope that justice is done. I think it has to be.
Yeah, we'll find out by the time it ends.
Yeah.
So for our next story, SNP MSP Michael Matheson's suspension. MSP Michael Matheson is facing a 27 sitting day suspension from Holyrood and could lose his salary for 54 days over his £11,000 iPad data roaming bill. Mr. Matheson was sanctioned by the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee on Thursday. The decision will now go before MSPs for approval. It comes after the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body concluded in March that he had breached the MSP Code of Conduct. The Falkirk West SNP MSP stood down as Scotland's Health Secretary in February, citing the SPCB investigation as the reason. Speaking to journalists following First Minister's questions, Mr. Matheson said, quote, I acknowledge the recommendations that the committee have made. I think it's pretty clear, though, that the process has become highly politicised, which has compromised the process and the fairness of the process. Quote, I also think the sanctions they've imposed are excessive and they're unfair. Mr. Matheson said it is now for the Parliament to decide on the next steps for the report, and said he would, quote, abide by whatever decision it takes. The suspension of The suspension of 27 sitting days was recommended by the committee member MSP Annie Wells and supported by Conservative colleague Oliver Mundell. SNP members Jackie Dunbar and Alistair Allen disagreed, with the deciding vote made by convener Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield said, quote, I did not cast my vote on a personal view, but in my capacity as a conveyor, I recognise that the committee would otherwise not have been in a position to make a recommendation. So, Siobhan, do you think it was like politicized, the protest for his suspension?
Well, it was, yes, because one of the Conservatives who was on the panel expressed complete subjectivity before that decision was taken. So it was politicised because when you're on a panel, you're supposed to be objective. You're supposed to consider the fact. You're not supposed to go to the media beforehand and say he's guilty, he's guilty, he's guilty. Okay, so in that respect, yes, I think it was politicised. I watched John Swinney today, in between kind of like standing at the printer, but I was watching John Swinney today, and he was talking about the Labour MP down in Westminster, who withdrew himself from an investigation into Boris Johnson because he did the same thing. He'd come out and said what Boris Johnson done was disgraceful, but he had self-awareness enough to recognise that actually, that he'd already shown he couldn't be objective in that process. So it was. And I'm going to draw your attention to the 2021 investigation into the Alex Salmond affair as well, when we had MPs on that panel in that investigation who were leaking information dangerously. So, because it was compromising the name of the women that were involved as well. So there was an element of politicisation there as well. Having said that, Michael Matheson, I think, should be disciplined for it. I'm not. I mean, I'm not against that level of discipline,
Yeah.
to be perfectly honest. But what I do find a bit galling is that we have other MSPs who have done similar and never been sanctioned to that degree. So there has to be not just objectivity in terms of assessing it, but there has to be comparative discipline. And I am drawn attention to, I don't know if you watched Douglas Ross today. I mean, he in 2021 he failed to declare £28,000. He's the kind of conservative leader, and he stood up as if butter would not melt. Now, I'm not defending Michael Matheson. I don't think personally his actions are defence worthy. I think he should have declared. I think what he did was wrong, and he should have been, and he did the right thing eventually to resign. But there is an element of politicisation in that here. And the problem that we have often is that there is a lot of double standards, as the SNP is often held to a much, much higher standard than anyone else. It doesn't make what Michael Matheson did right. It doesn't. If we're going to discipline him to that degree, then we have to enshrine a process that makes it fair and equitable for every case that comes up in the future. So it's about being fair across the board and not just picking on people because they're SNP. And I say that quite guardedly because, like I say, I do think that Michael Matheson, he deserves to be disciplined. It's always the case that if you're in another party, then you don't get disciplined so much. And we look at cases and you think, how on earth are they getting away with that?
Yeah.
So there is a problem. It is a problem. I think it was Annie Wells, who stood and said he's guilty, he's guilty, he's guilty, and she
Okay.
sat on that committee. So
Yeah.
that's inappropriate.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair response, and it sort of leads me to like the second question. Like, do you think like MPs or MSPs taking out a lot of expenses is like a broader problem, like regardless of this story? Because I guess just for
I
your
think
answer,
oh, sorry, yeah,
I was just to add a bit of context. Obviously they get paid quite high salaries to start with,
yeah,
And I feel like a lot of people think if I'm making £80,000 a year or whatever it is, do I really need to be taking another 10, 20,000 on top of that?
I think the problem that we have is, like, there was a big expenses scandal in Westminster a good few years ago as well, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of for the public, there is a kind of a certain understanding that, as you said, it's like the expenses are horrendous. But if you think of something like an MP's expenses, for instance, their expenses is to run their office as well. So whilst it might look a lot, there is a lot of kind of, there is a lot of kind of, you run the office, you've kind of, you employ staff, etc., etc. So there's legitimate expenses.
Yeah.
Um, it's tightening up of that process. It's tightening up. I am on a COSLA qualities board as a counsellor, and one of the issues that came up rather interestingly was about expenses, and actually that a lot of people were worried about taking any expenses because it was felt that the public would, and maybe kind of with some justification, the public felt that they might see that as like, well, you're abusing your position of power. But this is things like, and if you've got a babysitter and your next meeting's there, etc. So some of them were legitimate. It's trying to be robust in what is a legitimate
Yeah.
expense and what is not a legitimate expense. But the problem that we have is that there is no trust in the process now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I don't think Michael Matheson has helped it within the Scottish Parliament either.
Moving on to our last story, UN votes to declare July the 7th as Srebrenica Genocide Remembrance Day. The United Nations on Thursday passed a resolution to designate July 11th as Srebrenica Genocide Remembrance Day, with overwhelming support from the General Assembly. The resolution, spearheaded by Germany with co-sponsorship from more than 40 countries, calls for July 11th to be declared, quote, International Day of Reflection and Commemoration of the 1995 Genocide in Srebrenica. The vote passed with 84 nations voting in favour and 19 against, with a total of 68 countries abstaining. Condemning the denial of the Srebrenica genocide, the resolution denounced the glorification of crimes against humanity, genocide, and war criminals. So, I'm just wondering, Siobhan, what implications do you think that has for current politics?
I mean, it's a good thing that this is marked. It's good for
Yeah,
the victims and the survivors or the families that it's marked. But I'm going to be absolutely honest. I find it galling that Germany has brought this forward at the very same time when they're talking about Israel has the right to defend themselves in another genocide. So we can't commemorate one genocide while support another one. And it's the hypocrisy of that I find extremely galling. I'm going to be honest. All genocides should be marked and should be prevented. And we should be kind of fighting every single day to prevent another genocide after Srebrenica. So if we mark it, then we must commit to actually taking action when a real live genocide is happening right at this moment in time. It's like a bit like the poppy scenario, isn't it? It's that kind of the white poppy or the red poppy. The white poppy is about, yeah, let's commemorate the war dead, but let's also commit to peace overall. You can't have a day like mourning a genocide and supporting another one. It just feels utterly wrong, and I just wish that countries would begin to see that it is so duplicitous.
yeah. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. But before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programme will always be free to view, however, if you can afford just £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make regular monthly payments, thank you very much. Our focus must now move to securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. So thank you again to our guest Siobhan. Thanks, and
Thank
thanks
you.
and thanks for watching. Bye.